So what does it really mean to be well-informed on a critical global issue, especially, when headlines just give you a tiny piece of the puzzle? Today we're doing a deep dive into a pretty significant U.S. government report. It details major human rights concerns in Kenya in 2024. The report uses the phrase deterioration in the human rights situation there, which is strong language. Our mission today is basically to unpack this. We want to pull out the key bits of information, maybe some surprising facts from the U.S. State Department's latest human rights report. It will also bring in findings from Kenyan human rights groups to give you, hopefully, a clear, solid understanding of what's actually happening on the ground.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so important to look past those, quick headlines. You need to grasp the specifics, the details, and what they really imply. And a key point here, I think, is how this kind of information helps us connect the dots, right, on these really complex geopolitical events. It shows how things that might seem like isolated incidents can actually paint a much bigger and, frankly, more concerning picture about civil liberties and governance in a country. We'll be digging into some key areas: protest suppression, media freedom issues, even stuff reaching across borders.
Okay, so where should we start? The report seems to mostly link this deterioration, as they call it, to how the Kenyan government responded to those big youth-led Gen Z's protests. These happened back in June and July 2024. They started, as you might remember, against imposed tax hikes in the 2024 finance bill. But interestingly, even after President Ruto withdrew that bill, the protests didn't just stop. They sort of shifted, became broader anti-government demonstrations.
Exactly. And that really sets the context for the specific problems the U.S. report points to. It states quite directly that authorities reportedly committed numerous abuses during these protests. That's a very direct assertion. It really warrants a closer look.
Yeah, numerous abuses definitely sound serious. The report gets specific, mentioning things like unlawful killings, physical violence, arbitrary arrests and detentions. And when you hear the numbers from local Kenyan groups mentioned in the report, the Kenya National Commission on Human Rights, the KNCHR, they recorded 60 protest-related deaths. And the Independent Policing Oversight Authority, IPOA, reported 50 deaths and 199 injuries. And they explicitly blamed excessive police force. Well, it's important to remember these aren't just statistics, right?
Yeah.
Each number represents a real person, a family affected.
That's absolutely right. And beyond just the awful numbers, what's also quite chilling is the pattern of arbitrary arrests and detentions, targeting protesters, dissidents. The report also makes a point of mentioning the use of hooded, masked officers, often in civilian clothes, during these operations. Now, this happened even though a high court ruling last year specifically barred police from wearing civilian clothes or masks or hiding their faces during protests. So ignoring a high court ruling like that, it's a pretty strong signal, isn't it? It sort of suggests a deliberate attempt to hide identities and get around judicial oversight, basically undermining the rule of law. And adding to that, the KNCHR reported in December 2024 finding 82 cases of abductions or enforced disappearances just since June. And 29 people were still missing at that point. Those who were eventually let go, they said they were warned, apparently, by people they thought were police, not to post anything protest-related on social media. And many were held for long periods without any charges being filed. What does that tell you about how dissent is being handled?
Yeah, it certainly points towards tactics aimed at, scaring people into silence rather than engaging with the issues. And it wasn't just during the protests. The report also talks about disturbing accounts of torture and violence by police and prison officials more generally, apparently used during interrogations and also to punish people waiting for trial or even convicted prisoners.
And human rights NGOs cited in the report, they detailed the kinds of torture used. They said beatings, being tied up in painful positions, electric shock. Those were apparently the most common methods. You connect that back to the bigger picture, it really highlights this pervasive problem: impunity. The report identifies impunity as a serious problem across security agencies. That's a direct quote. So this isn't just about a few bad apples, right? It suggests a systemic issue where the systems for accountability are either broken or maybe being deliberately bypassed, which of course gives very little incentive for police to follow the rules. NGOs specifically noted that the government didn't acknowledge these police abuses from the June and July protests, nor did they hold any officers accountable.
Wow. That's a really crucial point about the system itself failing. And it sounds like accountability was actively blocked sometimes. The report mentions police officials sometimes resisting investigations and even detaining human rights activists who were trying to file complaints. Plus, they apparently use things like disciplinary transfers, moving officers around, and other tactics to basically hide who did what and make investigations into alleged crimes really difficult. And building on that idea of things being maybe obscured or accountability being difficult within Kenya, the report brings up something with international implications. Transnational repression, that's the term Washington uses. This is basically when a government tries to silence or punish people beyond its own borders, often targeting its own citizens living abroad or refugees, like in this case. They give an example from July 2024. A registered Ugandan refugee living in Kenya was arrested in Kisumu, along with 36 other Ugandans, members of the opposition group FDC, the Forum for Democratic Change. And this wasn't just Kenyan police, it was reportedly a joint Kenyan-Ugandan security operation. This group, they'd apparently traveled for some kind of training course, were forcibly sent back to Uganda, and then charged with terrorism-related offenses.
Yeah, and there's another really concerning example from November. Kitsa Besigye, a very well-known veteran Ugandan opposition politician. He was apparently kidnapped by Ugandan agents while he was just visiting Nairobi for a book launch, then driven across the border to Kampala, and now he's facing treason charges back in Uganda. What's quite interesting here is the conflicting stories. Kenyan officials initially said they didn't know anything about it, but Ugandan authorities apparently maintained it was a coordinated action. This kind of cross-border stuff, it's not just a one-off incident, is it? It sets a really worrying precedent for how political exiles are treated, and it kind of undermines the whole idea of international protection for refugees.
Absolutely. The report doesn't spell out why Kenyan officials might deny involvement if Uganda says it was coordinated, but that contradiction itself raises a lot of questions about sovereignty and cooperation, doesn't it? Okay, shifting focus slightly, but still related to control, the report also talks about restrictions on media freedom. It mentions intimidation, assaults on journalists, sometimes even during live broadcasts, and also cases where media outlets basically censored themselves after threats from the government.
Right, and the Media Council of Kenya, their own report is quite specific on this. They documented at least 24 instances of violence and harassment against journalists during those Gen Z protests in June and July, and this came from police and also apparently government-aligned groups. It included journalists being detained, targeted with tear gas, other non-lethal weapons. It definitely paints a picture of an intimidating environment for the press.
So beyond these, let's call them major flashpoints, the protests, impunity, media, transnational issues, the report also touches on other serious concerns, just to give that full picture. Things like poor enforcement of labor rights, which obviously can lead to exploitation, unsafe working conditions, and the tragic fact that practices like child marriage and female genital mutilation still persist in some communities. These highlight ongoing struggles for just basic human dignity.
Exactly. So while the report does acknowledge that the government reportedly took some steps to identify and punish officials involved in abuses, the main takeaway, the consistent finding it circles back to, is that impunity was a problem at all levels of government. That's really the critical point. It reinforces that this isn't just isolated incidents, but something systemic, affecting various parts of the government structure.
So wrapping this up, what does this all mean for you listening? Our deep dive today shows a really complex, multi-layered picture of human rights issues in Kenya. You've got the suppression of those youth protests, widespread reports of violence, arbitrary detentions, disappearances. Then there are the challenges to media freedom, these alarming cases of transnational repression we talked about. And running underneath all of it is this significant, persistent problem of impunity, of lack of accountability.
Yeah, and what's fascinating here, I think, is seeing how all these different pieces, these individual incidents and systemic problems weave together. They paint a really complex picture of governance and civil liberties in Kenya right now. You really have to think about, well, what are the implications of reports like this for the country's stability, yes, but also for its relationships on the international stage?
So maybe a final thought to leave you with. Consider how these patterns of abuses we've discussed, laid out in this report, how might they shape the relationship between a government and its own people? And also, what role does consistent external monitoring like the State Department report actually play in bringing these kinds of issues to light?